I am really, really honored to be with these other people. These are big thinkers. But, when they first asked me to, or they sent, they asked you a year ago, and you look at your calendar and there's nothing going on, you say, sure, fine, I'll do it. And then, of course, everything's going on. But they said nothing. They said, we want you to write about 3 things you're thinking of. I'm like, really? What am I going to have for dinner? Did I remember to give the dog her heartworm this month? Should I have another cup of coffee? And then they said, and how this relates to a public university. So I'm thinking, well, that probably really isn't that relevant to a public university. So I started thinking, well, okay, it's a public university. So I thought, well, what are the 3 things that I should be thinking about as part of a public university? Oh, big learning event. And I thought it would be, did I do it backwards? I don't know. It's got an arrow on it. Well, as you can see, my mind went blank. But if we got it to work, what it would say is, really, it had an arrow on it.
Okay. I think maybe
you think I did?
Yeah, try it again.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm hitting that button. Well, anyway, there we go. Okay, the 3 things I'm thinking of are the 3 legs of the stool of academic overall, right? The 3 university legs are research, teaching, and service. So that's what I was thinking of. And so my research, I thought I'd take a lofty title of what my research is. Deconstructing what happens at evaluation junctures in academic STEM careers that disadvantage individuals from historically low status groups. Doesn't that sound really good? I had to do that because if you saw the stuff these other people wrote, I mean, it's amazing. So what I'm really interested in is figuring out why. And since, Title IX was in 1972, and that opened all doors for women in higher education. So why is it that after all that time, we don't see equity at every level in every discipline in STEM? So science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. Why don't we see 50% all the way up? And this really interested me, particularly, as Kathy said, when I became the first woman with tenure, or the only woman with tenure in my department way back in 1990. So I decided to study this, and I'd like to acknowledge all the people of the team I'm currently working with that would fit on this slide. I know there's others, but I'd like to acknowledge there's a lot of working parts with this research, and everybody's working very hard. So, and I'd also really like to acknowledge all the people over the years who funded my research, particularly the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. So the premise of my research has been that the mere existence of cultural stereotypes leads all of us unintentionally and unwittingly to bias in our judgments and decision makings. And these biases, these so-called implicit biases in contemporary prejudice research, these are called implicit biases, conspire in multiple ways to prevent the advancement of women and people from other underrepresented groups in academic careers, particularly as they get toward leadership. I never know if it's going to work or not. Whoops. Whee! Am I supposed to point it at something? Oh, they are? Oh, okay, next. Okay. So if we just look at cultural stereotypes that exist about men and women, if I asked you, what are stereotypes about typical men? You'd be able to tell me. You'd say, well, the kind of abstract view of man is that they're decisive, competitive, ambitious, independent, willing to take risks, strong, brave. You could tell me these things whether you believe them or not, and even if you know men who do not have these traits, you could tell me these indeed are the cultural stereotypes that exist about men. And generally, social psychologists call these traits and behaviors agentic behaviors and traits. These are things that require action, agency. And similarly, if I asked you what are the cultural stereotypes that exist about women, again, whether you believe them or not, you could tell me, right? So sort of the abstract view of women is that they're nurturing, gentle, sympathetic, supportive, dependent, nice, and these are subsumed under the term communal behavior. So men, agentic, women, communal. So you might think, well, how would just the existence of these stereotypes influence in some ways the advancement of women in STEM? And I'm hoping I know what slide is coming up next. Okay, next. Okay, yeah, and it's stacked, so we have to run through it. Next. Okay, so so I don't need this. So if you just, what are some of the major things that determine whether men or women are going to be successful in an academic career? I don't know about other fields, but certainly in biomedical sciences, it is whether you can get funding from a federal agency. So let's look at the National Institutes of Health and look at success for grant funding by gender. So there's several studies that have looked at this, and overall, very little difference in success rates of men and women when they apply for NIH grants. But when you see a difference, it is exactly where you would predict from the way these stereotypes would work on decision making and judgment. So it is for the highly prestigious grants, like the NIH Director's Pioneer Award. It's for the very high budget grants. It's for the high status grants, the center grants, and it's for experienced investigators going back in to renew their NIH grants. These are called Type 2 renewals. So this is where you have both leader and scientist, both of which are more tightly linked with male, kind of working against women applicants. It's more of a lack of fit for women applying for these scientific leadership grants. So that's the way one would predict these stereotypes would work on the evaluation of grants, and that is what we see. And then we have literally hundreds of studies over 30 years from social psychology that use what's called a Goldberg design. So some piece of work, a manuscript, a resume, a grant application, is randomly assigned a male or female gendered identifier. It could be a name, could be a picture, and there's the consistent finding over 30 years with essentially no change that both men and women will evaluate the quality of that work as lower, lesser, if they think it was done by a woman. And then last year we have a study that has gotten a lot of attention from one of our own former colleagues, Jo Handelsman, who's now at Yale, taking a Goldberg study and plopping it right down in the middle of science. So she took a resume from a student who was completing college, trying to decide whether they wanted a science career or not, applying for a lab manager position. And she sent that resume around to faculty at lots of different campuses in several different disciplines in science and asked them to help them evaluate their hiring processes, rating the applicants. And she found that both male and female faculty members rated the male applicant as more competent, more hireable, more deserving of mentorship, and worth a higher salary than the identically credentialed female applicant, whom they nevertheless thought was more likable. Exactly what one would predict for the way just knowing stereotypes would play out. Okay, let's see. All right, so I just, because I'm thinking about research, and because I really had no clue what I was supposed to say today, I thought I would just give you a whirlwind trip through the research we have done relevant to this area. So we found that female faculty are more likely to feel their careers are not taken seriously, feel unwelcome, and more vulnerable to attrition. This we did with an all-faculty survey in the medical school. We found that we looked at the top 25 ranked medical schools in the country and just pulled their tenure criteria off public websites and scanned them and found that those that contained the word leader versus those that did not had an odds ratio of 6 times less likely to be making significant progress in promoting women, increasing the proportion of women faculty with tenure over 7 years. We did a mixed method study of internal medicine residents. So internal medicine is the largest group of doctors. So 1 out of 5 doctors, men and women, go into internal medicine. And then there's general internists who may be your primary care physician, and then every body part has a subspecialty. So your cardiologist, your pulmonary doctor, your rheumatologist, your infectious disease specialist, your geriatrician, whatever. We're all internists. So how internal medicine goes is very relevant to the rest of medicine. So we did a mixed method study of internal medicine residents, and 30% of the female residents, none of the male residents, ranked gender as the #1 barrier to directing patient care. And in the interviews, female residents expressed a fear of social reprisal if they were too directive or used the wrong tone. So if you remember those assumptions I mentioned, those gender stereotypes, those assumptions have sort of a prescriptive edge to them. So if there's an assumption that women should be communal, men should be agentic, and if they behave too much out of that range, they suffer social penalties. And we know this for lots of reasons. One, that we have words in our language for men or women who violate these norms, right? So we have words for men like sissy and wimpy and effeminate, and we have words for women like bossy and domineering. So this fear of violating these norms was clearly expressed by women residents. They were worried about being bossy, they were worried about using the wrong tone, they were worried about not being nice. We did interview, we now have female chairs of a number of departments, and we interviewed faculty in those departments about the effectiveness of their chair. They didn't know we were looking at gender. We said we were looking at all new chairs. And the good thing is all the faculty never questioned the competence of their chairs around gender. And actually most felt it was a very good thing for their department to have a woman chair. And then many of you on campus may be familiar with the search committee workshops that we originally developed with an NSF grant, which now are pretty much embedded in the fabric of the university. And Jen Sheridan led a paper, did a quasi-experimental study looking at departments that had participated in one of these workshops versus departments that had not, and found those that participated significantly increased the percent of women faculty that they hired, and men and women were more satisfied with the hiring process in departments that participated in those workshops. The AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, which is the group of all academic medical centers, so like, 140 of them now. And they have attempted to standardize the dean's letter that is written for all graduating medical students as they go on into their residencies, their specialties and subspecialties. And they've tried to standard this with something called the Medical Student Performance Evaluation, the MSPE. And there's some studies showing that letters of recommendation for men and women are different. And we were wondering if gender stereotypes are so powerful that they could trump an external attempt to standardize letters of recommendation. So we were able to procure over 400 letters of recommendation from Dartmouth, a very competitive radiology residency. And we did a linguistic analysis of these letters and found that very subtly, the language used looked like it was sort of socializing women toward the more communal specialties, family medicine, and men toward the higher status specialties and surgical subspecialties. So that was interesting. And then we developed a course on leadership to try to increase women's leadership self-efficacy, because there's a lot of research showing that women who have high leadership self-efficacy are kind of protected from some of the cognitive processes that might make them work against themselves. And we found that that course did indeed increase leadership self-efficacy. Our fellow, who's here, Christine Kolomainen, found that internal medicine residents have to lead cardiopulmonary resuscitation. That's really important. That's, somebody's, you probably watched ER or some of these movies, so cardiopulmonary resuscitation is very important. They call it code blue, and in the hospital at night, it is the internal medicine residents who have to run those. And we thought, wow, this kind of leadership as it's described in the literature is very agentic. It's very task-oriented leadership, and we wondered how gender figured out in this. And we just Christine interviewed 25 internal medicine residents, and indeed, it's far more stressful for women to engage in this directive-type leadership task, although they feel confident doing it, and nobody said they observed any deficits in performance of men or women doing this. Nevertheless, it was more stressful for women. And then another one of my wonderful colleagues, Anna Cates, did a quantitative text analysis of the reviews, the critiques that reviewers of NIH proposals write. Because we're trying to get at this, why is there this difference in funding? And we thought, well, the way reviewers write is sort of a window into how they think. And she did indeed find evidence of significant differences in the kinds of words that people use in men's grants and women's grants. And it appears that women get far more enthusiastic, positive things said about them, although they get the same score. And then finally, we did a systematic review of all experimental studies that had been done since Title IX in a hiring setting that looked at some intervention and its impact on gender bias. And we found 27 studies that met our criteria. And so I'll give you the synthesis of that on the next slide. Oh, it stacks, too. This will be fun for whoever's pushing the button. Okay, so at least one randomized control trial shows that institutions could do, if they wanted to, the following to mitigate the likelihood that gender bias would influence hiring decisions. They could infuse the environment with statements that say, research evidence shows equivalent gender competence in whatever role you're hiring for. They could encourage raters to take adequate time and agree on criteria before they interview any applicant. They could allow applicants opportunity to provide a lot of detail about their job-relevant experience and activities. That prevents assumptions from filling in. They could strive for the applicant pool to have at least 25% women. That seems to mitigate stereotypes. They should not ask about parenthood status. They should use structured versus unstructured interview questions and avoid man-suffix job titles. So it really doesn't take much information to prime the brain and change the way it evaluates men and women. This has been shown in a number of studies. But McConnell in this study found simply having that man on the word of chair influenced the way people evaluated a job. So the exact same job description, if it was called chairman versus chair, both men and women assumed that to be successful in that job would require more agentic traits. So those of you who have chairman, take the man up. And then using an inclusion rather than an exclusion strategy for selection from the final list in a search process. So now this would mean exclusion mindset would be, who on this list should we exclude from the next stage of our hiring? Inclusion would be, who on this list should we keep in? Should we include for the next stage? Now, statistically, you might think that would get you to the same place, but there's a whole field of decision analysis that shows that consistently the inclusion strategy gives you a shorter, more individuated list that is least likely to be influenced by stereotypes. A simple thing. And the final thing, implement training workshops for personnel decision makers. So you could all be doing that and say you were translating evidence into practice. Okay, so I just want to point out, I have particularly focused on gender, but these implicit processes as they play out can disadvantage many groups. And just to give you some research in a race context, implicit bias, measured implicit bias, because there's ways of measuring bias now. have predicted awkward body language and conversations between a white student and a black student, a white student and a black experimenter, interpretation of friendliness and facial expression, more negative evaluations of a black versus a white individual's ambiguous behavior, inadequate prescription of opioid analgesics in identical clinical vignettes except where the race is different, and failure to follow treatment guidelines in prescribing blood thinners for identical patients except for race who are having acute heart attacks. So my current work, I've had just the, first of all, I love this campus. I love a public university because there's so many smart people around, and it turns out the number one researcher in the field of prejudice is chair of our psychology department. So I have had the delight for the last 3 or 4 years of collaborating with Trish Devine, and we have been approaching the implicit bias related to these cultural stereotypes as simply habits of mind. So I come from a clinical world, and we know how to help patients change habits, right? Stop smoking, lose weight, take all their medications for the full 14 days, which I bet none of you ever do. So we designed a cluster randomized control trial of 92 departmental type units across all STEM disciplines on campus. And the goal of this study is to basically reduce the bias habit. And it's a workshop that we've been giving. Some of you may have participated in it. And our analyses, which are almost completed, show that the departments that participated in the workshop versus the waitlist control. So the controls are getting it too, but we took a little window in there to do the analyses. So the intervention departments versus the waitlist controls showed increased awareness of gender bias, increased motivation to engage in activities that would mitigate gender bias, self-efficacy that they could engage in these activities, positive outcome expectations, that is, if I engage in an activity to reduce gender bias, will it be good? I'm out of time. Okay, that's fine. And I'm doing a video game, and we're reviewing scientific review. Thank you.